what would be acted upon by the board or the executive director. Those are under the ESA, and those are under the authority of the fishery agencies, and they could use that authority at any time.
So, but then you would be saying that we should be deferring to the fish agency standards rather than our own.
Well, we would have to operate to whichever was more restrictive, whether it be our proposal here or an Old and Middle River flow set by the fishery agencies.
You're just saying it's not open-ended. It's not a matter of just the outflow number.
That's correct. That's
there
correct.
Are additional protections.
And if there were additional protections on the exports, that would actually result in higher outflow. So that would, in some respects, there would be control over. And I think, as our director indicated this morning, we've been on these day-to-day decision-making on current Old and Middle River management. That process, we would expect that to continue, even if we were especially if we were operating in this kind of this intermediate step level, to ensure that we continue to have appropriate levels of fishery protection.
Could you talk a little more about that? You're saying day-to-day on OMR. Is that related to, well, I was going to ask you about the voluntary turbidity action. So if you could talk about OMR, and also if it's unrelated on turbidity, if you could talk about anything you're doing to protect against turbidity issues as well.
Yes, it's actually very similar to the turbidity management that took place back in December. So this was kind of the day-to-day turbidity management, and the tool was operations of Old and Middle River flow and how that affects the movement of that turbidity into the South Delta. And that's currently what continues. In a sense, we had what you might call a second flush. So what we're trying to do at this point is prevent, the adults are very close to spawning at this point, but we're not too concerned about take of additional adults, but what we are concerned about is getting the adults to spawn too close to the pumps so that we have take issues of larval and juvenile smelt later in the spring. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of management decisions that are being made currently. So here is the actual historical data plus some projections. In blue, we have the net delta outflow. In red, we have the combined export rate. And in green would be the required delta outflow under D1641, the green dashed. So this is from January 1st through the current date, and then a projection through the end of the month. So you can see, if you start on the left-hand side there, at the beginning of January, you can see the tailing off of the hydrograph from the December rains. So we still had ample delta outflow at that point early on in the month. Exports were being controlled by the Old and Middle River criteria. This was a continuation of that turbidity management. And actually the NIMS buy-up kicked in as well, which requires a minus 5,000 OMR at maximum through June. So that was the controlling standard on or regulatory condition on the exports early in January. The conditions continued to dry out in January. You can see the green line there. That's 4,800 outflow requirement. That's the 7-day requirement for outflow in January. Because of the higher flows early in January, we were able to meet the monthly requirement of 6,000, and the 7-day requirement became the more governing control on outflow as we got later in the month. And as you can see, we didn't see another storm until early February. So let me back up. Here's right at February 1st, as I had indicated earlier, we had approval to operate to our proposal for the first 3 days of the month of February. Even under that proposal, we dropped exports and increased the increased the delta outflow to 5,500. The exports dropped to something around a little less than 3,500 export at that point. Then you can see starting on February 4th, with the order going final, we were required to then start operating to D1641. We took a further reduction in exports to get the outflow up to the 7,100 outflow mark for the 4th, 5th, and 6th of February. And so I've got computed volume there, which is pretty close to your staff's estimate. We had 5.5 thousand acre feet. So there was a roughly comparable amount of export that we were able to make the first 3 days of the February as a result of the temporary approval of the intermediate step. So that would have been the 1st through the 3rd February, and then the 4th through the 6th, we went down on the exports. As a result of the rain...
So just so I'm clear, so you're saying that instead of 5.1, it was 5.5? Or 5
That's our estimate.
in terms of cost?
In terms of cost, right. So once the rainstorm came early February, you can see what it did to the delta outflow in the hydrograph. And you can also see in the green, you can see there was the talk about the 1 day at Chips Island that was required based on the 8 river index in January. There was 1 day required, and that shows up there. I show it as being met on the first day of the increase on that, of the flows from the increase in the natural flows. And so, one of the other telling pieces of this is the exports continue to be controlled by OMR throughout the entire period up to now. And this is fairly typical as far as the amount of outflow that you see that the estuary actually received versus what the standard was. The standard requires us to meet a certain outflow on every day of the year, right? Or 3-day average. In reality, there's going to be rain events where the hydrographs are uncontrollable, especially with export-controlled conditions due to other regulation. And this is typical. You will see more outflow than D6041 calls for, and you can see in this case that was certainly the case here in February. Now we're making a projection on how fast this hydrograph will drop off between now and the end of February. And it does not appear that, now this is somewhat subjective, others can have different ideas on how this projection will actually play out, but this is essentially trying to mimic the reduction that occurred from the December rains. By the time we get to the end of the month, if it doesn't rain again, we may be close to this intermediate step coming back into play. Now we will, that being said, you can see the blue line I show coming slightly below 7,100. That is because the D1641 also allows us to meet that requirement through water quality. And undoubtedly, water quality will be good enough, at least initially, to allow the outflow to drop, the nominal outflow drop below 7,100, but we would still have X2 west of Collinsville for a significant amount of time. So that would allow us the opportunity to export a little, or allow the outflow to drop a little below the 7,100. So this is just kind of continuing that projection into March, and this assumes essentially a bone dry March, and so the scale looks very different from the previous graphic for February with the storm in it. But this would be a continuation of the solid blue line is operating to the order as written, so the 7100 would need to be maintained, and that would require gradual reductions of exports, and so the assumption is the inflow to the delta would continue to drop off, and to compensate, the projects would need to continue to reduce their exports to maintain the 7100. At some point, we would, if it continued to drop off enough, at 4,000, we would have 4,000 outflow. We would be required to add additional supplies from upstream. Now, that would take it would take a very long dry stretch for that to occur, but that's certainly possible. It's not shown here. The dashed line on there would be operating under our proposal, so that would allow the outflow, the dashed line, to, as the inflows drop off, the delta outflow would continue to drop off, and we would once we hit a 3,500. Well, okay, first let me back up a little bit. We would have to drop the exports to 3,500 to continue to maintain the 7,100 until at the point at which we are at the 3,500 combined export, and then our proposal is we would remain at that level until the outflow drops to 5,500. So that's the difference you see between the dashed and the solid lines there. The two wedges are equal. So that's the trade-off of outflow to export in this hypothetical, because we don't really know what's going to happen in March.
Right.
If we get anything close to a normal type precipitation pattern, this probably won't come into play. The other piece there is, as was mentioned, the Chips Island requirement for March. And that there's a very steep curve on what the requirement could be for March. And it could be anywhere, what we're estimating is anywhere from about 15 days to the entire month. Could easily be the entire month. It's pretty easy to trigger the entire month for Chips Island, regardless of how dry it is. But then there's the aspect of the carryover days that was brought up this morning, and we're projecting we would have maybe 15 to 20 carryover days because of that the large peak that you saw. We get some credit for that, and we can apply that to March. And so there might be something like 10 days requirement, could anywhere 0 to 10 days of the Chips Island requirement. And so some export of that, of not meeting that requirement, that is under the approved TUCP. That's the approved part. Mm-hmm. And again, we estimate maybe up to 100,000 acre feet. That's a different 100,000 acre feet, but mm-hmm. Roughly that could be a benefit that we receive. Undoubtedly, though, if we did have that full requirement, it could not be met with just export reductions alone. It would require some degree of upstream releases. So there would be some upstream savings associated with that as well. But again, these are very hypothetical because it assumes something that we really can't forecast at this point. It would occur in a dry scenario. Of course, under a very dry scenario, that's where the balancing becomes even more critical.
Mm-hmm. Well, appreciate you doing
yeah.
it. We asked you to do the worst case scenario.
So that's that piece there. I'm going to hand it off now, I think, to Ron to talk a little bit about the San Joaquin River.
Just so that I'm really clear, because I'm looking at this water supply cost of not approving the tiered exports for 1,000 acre feet. So you agree with the February 6 to 18 was no cost, or do you? I couldn't tell.
Yes, I agree that the 7th, I agree, the 7th through the 18th, there's no cost.
7 to
I think there
18.
was a cost associated with the 4th through the 6th, first
Okay.
3 days. Yeah. So I think I
Right.
think I'm pretty close to the estimates of your staff.
And are you in agreement with the low and high estimate for February 18 to 28, which is 0 if there's rain, and 17 if there's not?
Yeah, I think it's unlikely there will be a cost between now and the end of the month.
Okay.
And a big factor with that, again, is the water quality aspect of that. Even if the
Okay.
flows were to drop off quickly,
That's what I thought I heard.
the water
Okay.
quality would maintain for probably undoubtedly through the end of the month.
Right. And then the speculation is on March.
And the speculation is on March,
Worry about
right?
that.
And I
Okay.
think that 100,000 acre foot mark fits pretty comparable with some of the estimates that your staff had as well for the March piece. I think there was a range that was given, but I think it's comparable.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is one of those issues that through the order in which people have been speaking, we're just starting to talk salinity. I know we'll have quite a few speakers talking about that later as well.
So again, this is Ron Milligan with Reclamation talking for the CVP and moving on to another item or area within our petition. A lot of what you heard earlier this morning from various parties were folks from the CVP service area, so I won't go into a lot of the dynamics, but obviously there's a lot going on within our service group and why we've got a keen interest in with the department about the previous topic, which is why there is excess water or abandoned water in the Delta. What do we do with that if we were to get into a dry cycle going forward? Because again, I think a couple of the topics I'm going to hit on relate to conservation of the stored water we already have and what's the best use of that. So one of the items that we had in our petition request was to ask for a lower base flow floor as it relates to San Joaquin River. The earlier material that both Bill and John had just showed that San Joaquin River Basin is just on well, I'll say a lower plane than we are kind of been talking about a lot of the Sacramento's concerns. The severity of the now this being the 4th year of hydrology is much worse. The skew over the last 3 years of the snowpack, the limited snowpack we've had has been a little bit more abundant as you got to either the central or north Sierra. Southern Sierra has really been stressed. The number for storage at Exchequer is just a leading indicator of the storage that we're seeing at New Melones. Even Don Pedro's behind. Inflows that we've seen into Millerton. But if you just continue to go down through the Southern Sierra, Pine Flat, Isabella, all of those are really in dire shape. So one of the interesting dynamics is that we don't see or anticipate a lot of water being available, both in terms of stored water and potential for purchases that might make up some flows. So, but I did want to kind of illustrate Vernalis flows here back from December to current. And one thing that has been kind of interesting is that we've seen a couple episodes now with some spike up of salinity at Vernalis at times where not when the flow is at its lowest, and you might think of it as an issue with dilution, but seems to have been that the rain events have kind of mobilized some salts, and we've seen some fairly spikiness in the salinity at times where we're just coming off the peak of some rain or just in the midst of it. And these two periods kind of illustrate that. One was the subject of an earlier correspondence to the board from Reclamation about the December, and then this is on a 30-day running average for this salinity at Vernalis. And we had some really, really high days, and how do we deal with those? And we tried to at least keep that within a bound, but we're in an episode again where we're making some increased releases from at Goodwin taking some water out of storage at Maloney's to deal with salinity at Vernalis, just to try to keep that from getting out of round as well. So this is something we're looking at. Last year when we looked at salinity through the summer, we found that, gee, it didn't take a lot of water to kind of manage to the salinity objectives through the summer because the flows were so low. This is actually turning into be a little bit bigger chunk of water, and we're giving some thought if we may need to either A, modify our request for March, potentially, and or think about this for any subsequent petition that may deal with April on. As to, this is not something, as again said, salinity last year was not something that was a very difficult thing to manage, but we're seeing some rather odd circumstances as this plays out right now. So I just wanted to kind of call that in, both that and even these flows, the peak there in December is only 1,800 CFS. This last event, only 1,200 CFS of Vernalis. These pale in comparison to the flows that we saw at Freeport, for example. So even the rain events we've had, you kind of see it on cumulative effects in terms of amount of water precipitation that Bill had for the San Joaquin. You see it at Vernalis as well. There's just not a lot of response, or there's not a lot of rainfall down there, and we're not seeing a lot of inflow to the Delta. John, could you go to the next slide? How about the next slide after that? This is a slide that we had from back, I think, last month, as part of our discussion about last year's order, and this kind of related to conserved water as it relates to last year's order by month. So this would be 2014, where we talked about a lot of water being moved back up into storage. A lot of that being in the April-May time frame, but a little bit also in the summer, and then again in October, given some of the relaxations we saw there. Trying to respond a little bit to the concern about some elements of the order from last year, and did it back some water and save some water upstream, and did that have some benefit as it relates to, let's say, cold water pool management? Which button is it, John? Is it? Where are we pointing towards? Here we are. This is just a page that was pulled out of our October contingency plan submittal to the board. It's a little fuzzy, but I just wanted to kind of, for this discussion, point out the upper right-hand corner plot, which had back in which did a kind of a hindcast or look back when we talked in the April drought operations plan. Some of our projected storages at Shasta, both with at that time a 90 and a 50% exceedance forecast. And what did those look like at that time? And then what did we actually receive? And in terms of Shasta, the actuals kind of peaked out a little bit better. So from an inflow standpoint, we actually saw a little better inflow, and some of the reoperation that we did in conjunction with both the order as well as working with Sac River settlement contractors on shifting their demands to line up when we were making temperature releases also kind of helped increase some of the storage when we got into the April, May, June period. And then that water was kind of bled out as we went through the summer. But we ended up a little bit better there in terms of overall storage. But the struggle last year for temperatures had a lot to do with the volume of the cold water pool and how that, the entire pool at Shasta heated up and kind of chewed into this. As much as I know from a staffing standpoint, the requirement in the current order to have a hindsight document as it relates to last year's temperature management on the Sacramento, I see this as an opportunity to fully discuss and outline just the dynamics of a plan and how that works and the interplay of Trinity, Whiskeytown, Shasta, Coldwater Pool, and how some of the decisions, although some of them being fairly subtle as we go through the year, and where we ended up, when we tracked pretty well with the modeling and the plan, and where that deviation really started to play out. So only as a flavor to that, I put this graph in. This is a plot of last year's Keswick releases. I pulled this off a CDEC, and hopefully, when you look at this a little closer on your screen, you can follow the blue tracking of that. These are just daily release numbers. The red shaded areas represent a range of flows for that particular month that we outlined in the drought contingency plan of last April. One of the concerns being, gee, were you had this plan from a release standpoint, were you just way out around with that, and this is an attempt to kind of grasp that. We had talked about back in April where some of the flows would be, and I kind of superimposed them here. April obviously shows a lot of success in our work to shift the demands with the Sac River settlement contractors out of April. So we had thought might be a range that we could do with the operating plan for drought in April. We actually were able to come in much lower than that and actually conserve some flow there. Part of that, though, came with, as those pent-up demands kind of built, we were probably towards the end of May for a time a little bit higher and a little out of that range. But overall, I think for that period, we saved quite a bit of water. As we moved into the June, July point in the drought plan, particularly if we were thinking that we did not have drought barriers in place for a 90% exceedance forecast, we had anticipated we may be at 10, 11,000 CFS outflow or release at Keswick. We were able to keep those flows back at this particular point, and these were adjustments as we made with the temperature plan as we went through at the time, that we could, particularly with the compliance point or the target location being up towards Clear Creek, that required probably a little less flow to kind of be able to manage to that particular location. So as you can see, we had significantly less water moving out in those 2 months. As we started to drop this down in August, we were on a trajectory coming from the higher number to the low. You see a little plateau in there, which was some discussion at the time, both in terms of the cold water pool, accessing the last bit of cold water was difficult, and this is particularly the latter half of August, holding the flows instead of a continued drop to deal with stranding issues, and probably dovetail, water that's marginal temperature-wise. Do you keep the flow up a little more for cover over the reds as well, so you have a little bigger thermal mass to deal with? And then the progression of how do you deal with those flows coming off of this and balancing some of the fall run concerns. So what you see a lot in the second half of August through September are a number of flows that are higher than was initially talked about in April, but are the product of the ongoing work with the temperature task group. So what we anticipate to do is do something like this, but build upon it, talk about, I think some of the material that Garwin will kind of show in terms of when the temperatures, we start losing control up there, and some of the decision points. One of the interesting ones is when do you start managing the temperatures in the Sac River? And what's difficult to know is when winter run are going to come in and spawn. And we were probably a little bit later. In retrospect, you see the number of spawners that came up. The spawning probably was a little on the later side than the average, but not necessarily out on the further periphery of the last decade or so. But the real question is, when do you start trying to hit 56 degrees? Do you kind of wait and save some of that cold water performance so that you can stretch it out the back end, or do you start it earlier? And that's always a dilemma, and that really requires a lot of input as to what you see in the river and what you think your returns are going to be. And there's no firm answer with that. So this is just the kind of, I think, hopefully will dovetail with a little bit of some of what Garwin will have as we talk about the dynamic of what we saw, but we certainly saw an advantage of the earlier April, May actions to conserve water upstream, or we wouldn't have gotten as far as we had. And not to be too preemptive of Garwin's presentation, but we've heard a lot about the 95% mortality. That's a really high number, and I think when Garwin shows some of the slides, I'd be the first to say that is not an optimal or even a acceptable level. But the question is, did we do, and I think to the document we'll be putting together in hindsight, will be, did we do the best that we could do? But I would hate to call even that 95% a failure. I think when you see this in light of the last decade, even in a year like 2011, which was very good for available cold water, the mortality in terms of what we see in terms of eggs to fry going past Red Bluff, at even that being the best year within the last 12, is at 50%. And the average is probably a 70% mortality. So we have, 400,000, winter run smolts going outwards past Red Bluff. My fear is if we hadn't taken some of these actions that we did early on, even though you had a really bad mortality computation there, you still had 400,000 smolts that you may not have had, or a big chunk of those may have been further lost if we hadn't taken some of these actions. So, and I think those are, we're going to see that's a significant portion of the overall winter run out-migration here. And I think that's the end of at least this segment of it.
Yeah, SaveOurWater.org and .com. Other questions, or can we move on to, you're not going anywhere, so.
I'm not, no, I'm afraid not.
Mr. Jackson, yeah. I'm sure they will.
No pressure. Good afternoon,
Afternoon.
Chair Marcus, members of the board. So the title here, NIMS Update to the State Water Resources Control Board, is not so much focused on the temporary urgency change petition, and especially the mid-step, but I will touch on that.
That'd be helpful.
Am I even down here? Had this problem last time.
Just kind of out that way, someplace. Oh,
Think so? Okay, so status of winter run. The TUCP and especially the mid-step, I think in general, we all understand what the asks were in the TUCP, and then the focus being the mid-step being the more controversial part of it. And then Shasta operations, what are we setting up ourselves for this water year 2015? So I think in general, so three months ago to this day, November 18th, I was here presenting to the board on behalf of the fish agencies this presentation where I copied and pasted the cover slide. So I thought I'd dust off a couple of the slides from that presentation. Slide 10, and this is on our website also, but slide 10 we talked about the ramifications of running out of cold water for winter run spawning, incubation of eggs and fry. This slide here, the green line indicates the temperatures at the Clear Creek temperature compliance point. And if you look up at August, that's where the temperatures start exceeding 56 degrees Fahrenheit on a regular basis, and it pretty much loses control beyond there. So green line is Clear Creek, red line is Keswick. Now this blue line is Keswick, and if you can remember what you saw earlier with green line and add a couple degrees, that would be Clear Creek. And when you look at around August 6th, August 20th, around there, and you go up from there, and you look at the green shading, that's when we see fry emergence. So when we talk about 95% mortality, the converse is about 5% survival. at 5% survival, we're thinking would probably be at the front end of the fry emergence. And that's key for a couple of reasons. One is, Ron was talking about, and I'll mention this earlier, that the standard is not 100% survival, and now we're talking about 5% survival. It's been low in general. The other aspect is when we're talking about winter run, actually any species, we talk about habitat diversity, genetic diversity, we want to spread it out. This water year, 2014, and brood year 2014 constricted that diversity because the majority of the run after this August-September time frame had that considerable mortality. So it's not just what the number is, but where is that number?
Where it is along the spectrum of time.
That's right. And like Ron mentioned, winter run, I think over the last 3 years, the adults have come up a little later, and that causes some issues as far as what we think they should do, and also water and operations, and how we want and need to sustain the 56 degrees for later in the year. So what does all this mean for winter run? Considerable mortality, so I mentioned 95% mortality or converse 5% survival, and that's a calculation looking at the juvenile production index at Red Bluff, the fry equivalents, divided by the number of eggs that we think are in the gravel. And that's how we came up with 5% survival. It's not just 5% survival, as I mentioned, it's where that survival is, and we think it's in the beginning part of the run. So what happened last year with the TUCP order, and did it help? Ron mentioned about 450,000 acre feet across, I think it was calendar year 2014. I just subtracted about, just eyeballing that graph, about 80,000 acre feet from October. October didn't benefit winter run necessarily. So we come up with about 370,000 acre feet. So if the 370,000 acre feet was conserved in Shasta, and if that water was part of that cold water pool, it's not just the volume of water, it's how cold the quality of the water, then there would be a benefit for winter run last year. That 5% would have been maybe higher. How much higher? Nobody knows.
What
But
you mean, let me just make sure I'm following what you're saying. You're saying that, I thought you were saying that the TUCP, because it allowed you to conserve water, may have made it as high as it was.
Yeah, that's right. It would have been, the survival probably would have been lower if it wasn't for the TUCP and the cold water storage associated with that. That's right. Thanks for the clarification. So that's the second bullet. So considerable mortality of eggs and fry. So go to the next slide, and this is what Ron was talking about earlier. So we see the dots show egg to fry survival, and the far right hand 2014 shows about the 5% survival. But you look across from 2012 through, or 2002 through 2014, it is the lowest survival, but the maximum survival in 2011, that's when we had a above normal, if not wet, water year. We see upwards of 50% survival, so none of these years have 100% survival anyway. So I wouldn't say that we don't need to worry about 2014 because the metric is now considerably lower, but we don't see 100% survival. Just naturally, I don't think it exists in nature.
But so you're saying, yeah, I don't think anybody thinks it's supposed to be 100%.
But when we talk about 95% survival, typically there's considerable, or 95% mortality, typically there's considerable mortality anyway.
Right. I mean, but people have argued, reading the comments, that that's understood. I think that's a given, but there's a big difference between 70 and 95 when you're talking about the survival of a run.
Sure.
I mean, not saying anybody's bad. We're just trying to figure out what happened so that we can do better this year, right?
So NIMS calculates a juvenile production estimate, JPE, and that's the estimate of the number of juveniles that we anticipate coming into the Delta each year. And we use typically the conversions of the number of eggs, the estimated survival from eggs to fry to Red Bluff, estimated survival from Red Bluff down to the Delta. In 2013, and I think in years before then, we've typically used 27% survival from egg to fry at Red Bluff. So 27% and then down to 5% for 2014. For 2014, the juvenile production estimate from 2014, we utilize that 5% survival to Red Bluff. So here are the numbers up to February 11th. You ask anybody, and anybody will give you totally different answers as to year class failure, success, what this means. And anybody can take these numbers and do whatever they want with it. But as we understand, the estimate is about 407,000 natural winter run that made it past Red Bluff this year. And that's from approximately 3,015 adults. That's total, so male and female. We also took 388 of those adults and put them into Livingston Stone National Fish Hatchery. And of those adults, we have approximately 609,000 juvenile coated wire tagged hatchery winter run that were released February 4th to 6th. So when you look at these numbers, 609,000 hatchery fish, 406,000 natural fish. That's more than 50%. It's probably, well, I'm not even going to guess. But when we look at the natural fish, that's in comparison with 2011. 2011, folks have considered year class failure, whatever kind of descriptions people might want to use. We have an estimate of 827 adults that returned, but 849,000 progeny. So that's more than double what we see now in 2014.
And right, and I remember when you talked about the point of this is that there are a lot of factors in their survival, right, including ocean conditions and the like.
Yes. Yeah. And it's not just the number of adults that came back, it's the progeny that were produced from those adults. So
Did you change the mix on hatchery versus natural? In other words, did you increase on hatchery, or is it usually about this percentage difference,
so
40 versus 60?
Well, the natural is whatever nature produces. The standard for Livingston Stone National Fish Hatchery is hopefully split 50-50, males and females, but capacity would be 120 for the broodstock each year. And we Fish and Wildlife Service, try to take natural fish, non-ad clipped at Keswick Trap. For this year, which I'm referring to 2014, we allowed up to 400 and take all adults, hatchery and natural. So it ended up being 388. The hatchery juvenile winter run, all have been coated wire tagged. There's 7 tag groups that are all released during those 3 days. And through our Southwest Fisheries Science Center, there's 2 groups that were acoustically tagged, 571 total. And now we have 3 receivers out there, not just to monitor the acoustic tagged fish, but in real time. So we know on a daily basis how many of those fish have passed any given point, and there's 3 locations in the Delta right now. And that helps us to monitor the situation with operations and with the storm also. So I mentioned the Winter Run JPE we issued on January 16th. So the final number that we came up with, an estimate of the number of juveniles entering the Delta is approximately 124,500 juveniles entering the Delta. This number ends up being a big deal in general. It's really low, so we're talking about the winter run population. But we also use that number to estimate to provide a limit to the incidental take of winter run at the federal and state fish facilities. And we also use that to monitor Old and Middle River flows. We have a default minimum of 2.5 fish per 1,000 acre feet of 2.5 fish lost in the older juvenile category, which includes winter run, before we require operational changes, usually through exports, but if something else like NDOI is controlling exports, in the case of early February, then no changes in operations are needed. If we calculate the fish density through the JPE for this year, it would have come out to 1.25 fish per 1,000 acre feet, but we embedded a minimum fish density of 2.5.
I'm not sure I understand that.
The fish densities are considerably lower this year, but for consideration of drought, we basically doubled the amount of allowable take before actions are taken through operations. So if we assume that the acoustically tagged fish have migrated downstream similar to the 600,000 non-acoustically tagged, then we're looking at about 25% of the hatchery fish in the Delta right now. And it really shocked everybody. The first detections were within 4 days of release, which I don't think anybody anticipated, including the scientists that tag these fish and just live and breathe science and winter run. In fact, 2 of the real-time receivers weren't even deployed by then, so they had to scramble to get those receivers out there.
So that means they're moving fast?
They're moving fast. We tried to time it to the earlier part of the storm that was anticipated, and we did that, but they came noticeably faster. So aside from the busyness of the slide, if you look at the middle column, second to the right, we have in the delta, this is the estimated distribution that we think for winter run, both natural and hatchery, spring run, and steelhead. We don't have green sturgeon because green sturgeon in general rear year-round in the delta, so they're there all the time, portions of them. So when you look at these numbers, most of the runs, most of the species are in the delta rearing, and when you look at the right side, exit the delta, there's not many that are exiting right now.
That means they're not exiting because they're rearing.
Correct. So TUCP and mid-step. I've heard intermediate step, mid-step, but I think we all know what we're talking about. Now D1641, when we're analyzing the effects of the action, which was the long-term operation of the Central Valley Project and State Water Project, which we issued a biological opinion June 4, 2009, part of the proposed action was implementation of the entirety of D1641. It's not something that we considered in terms of reclamation proposing that as part of their action. It was just part of the baseline assumption that we had. So we did analyze and consider D1641 as just a standard that everybody meaning the
Right, it's a
project
given
takers
in
will
your
apply.
biological opinions, right?
Yep. So here comes the TUCP. I mentioned water benefit from last year. We have the TUCP for this year. The difference is this mid-step. So the question, is there a benefit or not to the mid-step? And benefit is in the eye of the beholder. We heard plenty of speakers this morning talking about the benefit to farms, benefit to, or maybe not, benefit to fisheries. But I wanted to make clear, because I've heard a lot of reference about fisheries, fishery agency concurrence, and then the ultimate board order on, or executive director order on February 3rd, is a difference in standard of review. What we did was we analyzed the effect of the temporary urgency change, focusing on the mid-step, on our ESA listed species.
Right.
We understand that there's ecosystem benefits to D1641. We totally support those, and I think in our coordination with reclamation staff in the development of a biological review of the different parts of the TUCP and our ultimate concurrence, we acknowledge that reducing outflow does have adverse effects to the ecosystem in general. Same with increasing exports from the would have been 1,500 to the proposed 3,500 would have adverse effects. But the adverse effects that we're acknowledging were specifically for our listed species. We didn't analyze the entirety of what Tom Howard, he had the whole list of all the ecosystem benefits in D1641. So I'm not...
That is a challenge that most people don't understand.
Yeah. And just to be clear, I and our agency are not against exports. We just analyze the effect of the action on our listed species. Let's
I have a
see.
question.
Yes.
On the, in the order, there's quite a bit of discussion about entrainment. That would be an effect that you would have analyzed as part of your ESA biological opinion review.
That's
in
correct.
In the biological review document that you've submitted.
That's correct. And John mentioned the entrainment and some fallbacks of still implementing our biological opinion. So there's two aspects to that. One is that part of the proposal was still retaining the Old and Middle River triggers that are intact in the Fish and Wildlife Services and NIMS biological opinion. So with or without this mid-step, those fish density triggers will still be intact. The other is looking at the mid-step combined 3,500 CFS versus the 1,500 CFS would result in, or likely result in, more negative OMRs. But John had a slide that negative OMR would be approximately 3,200, and that's within the analysis that we provided in the 09 biological opinion. It didn't exceed that. One thing I did, and I think people might get tripped up on the term concurrence. So what I did was this morning I looked it up. What does concurrence mean? And Webster
Usually at
says
Webster's or Wikipedia?
Webster. Concurrence, according to Webster, means the state of agreeing with someone or something. So our ultimate concurrence with the TUCP issued on January 29th, and I'm going to read it here, says, in conclusion, NIMS concurs. We agree. But what did we agree with? NIMS concurs that the reclamation's project description is consistent with Action 123C. That action is drought contingency planning and drought exception procedures in our biological opinion, and meets the specified criteria for an interim contingency plan. We're making this finding based on both the biological review attached to reclamation's letter, which describes